Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I invite us all to stand as we lift every voice and sing.
invite you to remain standing for the invocation. Let us pray. Gracious God, our Heavenly Father, the supreme creator of all that is, seen and unseen, we invoke your presence here this evening as we prepare our minds and our hearts to receive insights on the timeline and the role of resistance during the era of slavery in Anguilla. Lord of our distant past and our approaching future, we ask your blessing and your unction on the organizers of this event and on all that will be said and presented this evening, so that all may bring honor and glory to your matchless name. In our lives, and we give you thanks for the faith of our fathers and mothers who persevered through the horrors of slavery, demonstrating a resilience of spirit that was born of their trust in you. We give you thanks for the gifts of intellect, of knowledge and education, that we may find occasions such as these to be beneficial for the edification of your people. For your holy scriptures remind us in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 7, to remember the days of old, consider the generations long past, so that valuable lessons may be learned, as knowledge is transferred from generation to generation. And so, Lord God, we humbly pray in the words of Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 1, that as we, the people called Anguillians, look to the rock from which we were cut and to the quarry from which we were hewn, we may indeed find valuable nuggets of truth and wisdom to help us to navigate the challenges of this present age and prepare us for the rigors that are yet to come. In Jesus' precious name, we pray these things, believing in our hearts with thanksgiving that you will hear from heaven and respond to the petitions of our hearts. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend Candice. Honorable members of the House of Assembly are present. Former Premier Mr. Victor F. Banks, Ms. Blondell Cuff, UK representative for the government of Anguilla, our Circuit Minister, Reverend Candice Niles, presenter, Mr. James Malik Fleming, Mr. Felix Fleming, circuit stewards and other officers of the Methodist Church, our pastor and members of the congregation, senior members of the government of Anguilla, past lecturers, Mrs. Stella Gums, Ruth Bingi, our Ebenezer family, our friends, colleagues, sisters, brothers, and those joining us on social media and other forums via Ebenezer People Facebook page or YouTube channel, Lloyd's Live, Radio Anguilla, ACN Television, Class FM, and all the forms of communication. Malliouhana Poetry Committee members, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ebenezer. We are in a sacred place. This place that was dedicated some 195 years ago. It was constructed by the hands of our enslaved ancestors. And so therefore, it is more than a building to us. It is a monument to faith, resilience, and community. It was here on this very place that our forebears gathered just about 191 years ago on August 1st, 1834, to celebrate the first Emancipation Day, the day when the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was supposed to come into effect across the British Empire. And so it is fitting that we gather here this evening. And on this symbolic occasion, the Malliouhana Poetry Committee offers its congratulations to the pastor and the members of the Ebenezer congregation on the 195th anniversary of the chapel, and to thank you for continuing to partner with us to host this very important lecture. Now, the annual Emancipation Lecture Series, which was officially launched in 2016, and somebody just said, well, it's going to be soon 10 years. So it was inspired by the late Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gums, activist, scholar, and former superintendent minister of this circuit. If we remember, one of his favorite refrains was, "Lest we forget." He passionately reminded us that the commemorative observance of emancipation is not optional, it is essential. We must recall the resilience and the persistence of our ancestors. We must teach our children from whence we came, lest we forget. So as we shape this evening's remembrance and celebrate the indomitable spirit of those who came before us, we also continue to honor the memory of Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gums. And although the Malliouhana Poetry Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gums Creative Nonfiction Awards are on pause this year, his memory will be honored later in the program with a special tribute by his son, the inspirational and very gifted Mr. Elliot Gums. Tonight, we are excited. And I know Reverend Wycherley would have been too, because we are welcoming a young rising Caribbean a voice in Caribbean scholarship, a young son of the soil, a Fleming, Mr. James Malik Fleming, as our 2025 Emancipation Lecture. I don't know about you, but his presence is a direct response to the call to elevate our young voices. You would have heard Carlisle Rogers when he presented the lecture. You would have heard all the others that come. We wanted to have our young people step up, and boy, like a true face-up Fleming, he step up. So Malik comes to us with the passion, wisdom, and deep historical thought and insight. He's ready to remind us that our past is relevant and that resistance is part of our legacy. So once again, I say welcome to Ebenezer, and I like how the space filling up already. And if you're on your way and you think you can just sit down and listen on, watching the screen, right, Lloyd? You need to come down to the historic Ebenezer Chapel, get the feel, and enjoy this experience, this Emancipation Lecture 2025, and all the other celebrations involved. And no, I'm not going to be up here all the time. I'm going to go down there and savor the moments. I want to introduce our chairperson for this evening. She is a passionate cultural advocate and a respected communicator and dedicated community leader whose life's work beautifully bridges public service, media, the arts, and youth and development. She sung like a powerhouse, ain't she? With over 2 decades of service at the Anguilla Social Security Board, where she currently serves as Statistics and Public Relations Officer, she is widely admired for her professionalism and creativity. She has also been a familiar voice and a face in Anguillian homes through her work with Creative Communications Network, KCN TV, for almost 30 years. Oh, you get up there, huh? She's the host of Anguilla Diary magazine. She's a distinguished and proud Toastmaster. She's the charter member of both the Anguilla and the Sugar City Toastmasters Club, and a dynamic mentor for emerging leaders. President of Full Stride Track Club, this former athlete who used to burn up the tracks. She's also the co-organizer of the Brown Bucket Invitational. But beyond her many roles, she is a poet, dynamic spoken word artist, a theater performer, and a fierce little Pan-Africanist. She once described herself as an African having a Caribbean experience with a quiet, rebellious spirit. She right fitting in for tonight, ain't she? And tonight she brings some of that passion, that pride, and that purpose to this gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, listeners, please join me in warmly welcoming and celebrating our chairperson for this evening for the 2025 Emancipation Lecture, Ms. Rosanna Brown herself.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Fleming Banks. And it's my honor to be your chairperson this evening for the 9th annual Emancipation Lecture here at Ebenezer. And let me say a happy 195th anniversary to all Ebenezer citizens. I was not fortunate to celebrate with you on Sunday, so I'm giving you my regards now. Happy anniversary. It is quite fitting for us to have this Emancipation Lecture here at Ebenezer in this sacred space, as you heard from Dr. Fleming Banks, why it is held at Ebenezer. As we gather here this evening, we do more than commemorate an important chapter in our history. We engage in sacred remembrance and a deep reckoning with the strength, resilience, and unyielding spirit of our ancestors. Emancipation is not just a historical milestone. It is a living legacy. It calls us to remember, to reflect, to renew our commitment to justice, dignity, and equity in our time. We are particularly proud to feature the grandfather-grandson duo in James Malik Fleming and Felix Fleming, sons of the soil, who will help us trace the lines of resistance etched across Anguilla's past and illuminate the courage that rose even in the driest of lands. As we begin, let's pause in reverence for those who dared to resist, those who hoped when hope was scarce, and those whose stories we continue to uncover and honor. Thank you for the pause. As we go through the program, do we have the Honorable Minister in the house? No? So we will then have a selection by Ebenezer Men's Fellowship.
the depleted members of the Ebenezer Men's Fellowship is going to be rendering the Negro spiritual Over My Head. Over My Head is a powerful spiritual born from the hardships of slavery in the American South. It expresses a deep longing for freedom and hope in the face of suffering, suggesting a connection to something greater than their immediate reality. The song's lyrics, particularly the line, "Over my head, I hear music in the air, there must be a God somewhere," highlights a spiritual resilience and belief in a higher power despite the harsh realities of bondage. You sit back and enjoy the selection.
Let's give them another round of applause. They started us off on the right footing. I don't know about you, but over my head, I also hear music and all the other things because there's a God somewhere. The Ebenezer Men's Fellowship. And of course, this lecture is organized with the Malliouhana Poetry Committee and the Ebenezer Men's Fellowship and Ebenezer Congregation. We will now hear from Mr. Elliot Gums. Salute to Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gums.
Greetings, Ebenezer. Lest we forget, it's a pleasure and honor to be here to celebrate this occasion and in salute of my dad. I have with me one of his many works, of which I will read an excerpt or preface and one of his poems, the first one entitled Let Freedom Ring. As sons and daughters of the African diaspora, we cannot build a lasting future on blame, hatred, vengeance, or self-pity. These are self-destructive and they sap our creative energy. Ours is the task to search deep within the treasure and nobility of the past, with all its imperfections, and claim those high ideals to serve as a catalyst to nerve us on to build a noble heritage for generations yet unborn. As sons and daughters of freedom, the most which is expected of us in return for what is entrusted to us is to take a stand for justice, to live a life of freedom, to educate our children, to live with character and integrity, and stand proud and free as children of destiny. Let freedom ring. Let freedom ring. Trumpet its refrain again and again over lofty mountain ranges, across the verdant plains, down in the valleys, in villages and cities. The freedom to be human, the freedom of creative expression, the freedom to dream. Pursue those dreams relentlessly and turn those dreams into reality. Let freedom ring until wrongs are righted, oppression and discrimination ended, the schemes of evil denied, and the wretched scars of poverty erased. Then will all God's children from every race and nation, whatever their political affiliation, skin color, ethnic origin, social status, or religious persuasion, inherit a new land where peace and prosperity abound. Thank you. One of my dad's favorite songs by the great Bob Marley is a song I'm going to invite the Roots Bingy to come up here and perform with me a little early. Redemption song.
Thank you, Mr. Gomes, for that salute in poetry and song to your dad, Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gomes. Roots Bingy, you stay. Stay. You were up next, so you were just early. You're already here. You stay and you give us a selection as we collect. We do the collection of offering in support of the Ebenezer Building Restoration Fund. So we'll now hear from Roots Bingy, who's always present for us for the Emancipation lecture, and they had a special connection with Dr. Wycherley. Thank you, Roots Bingy. I will now call on Ms. Avan Carty, a member of the Malliouhana Poetry Committee, to introduce our speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, after you have been so eloquently and comprehensively greeted, I simply need to say good afternoon, good evening to you all. Before I begin the introduction of our esteemed speaker, though, please allow me to present a prologue which recognizes his grandfather, Mr. Felix Fleming. And I read, playwright, producer, director, extemporary actor, philanthropist, and educator in the arts, Anguilla's Felix E. Fleming has more than 50 years' experience in theater arts. He has produced and directed over 100 plays and has penned scores of skits and some 15 full-length plays. Fleming was the vision and the founding member of the Anguilla Virgin Islands Society and the Rygholt Center Repertory Theatre in St. Thomas and the Sunshine Theatre Company here on Anguilla. Please give him a round of applause. It is my equally esteemed pleasure to present to you a few words, because I'm sure they're just a few words, about Mr. James Malik Fleming, our guest lecturer for this evening. The previous presentation by Ruth Bingy and Mr. Gums, I think, has softened and readied our minds, our hearts, and indeed our souls for what is in store for us this evening. So Mr. James Malik Fleming is an Anguillan researcher and cultural commentator currently based in the United States. With a deep-rooted commitment to the preservation and critical exploration of Black and Caribbean history, his work places special emphasis on Anguilla's historical experience from the early colonial period through to the 1967 revolution and into present-day search for identity and sovereignty. James is proud of his Anguillan lineage and brings a passionate and personal perspective to his historical inquiry. His presentations are marked by thoughtful engagement with themes of resistance, emancipation, and post-colonial consciousness. In 2024, he was a featured presenter at the Caribbean Genealogy Conference, where he explored the intersections of family, memory, and historical silence within the Caribbean diaspora. His intellectual framework is shaped by leading voices in anti-colonial and Black thought, including Eric Williams, Frantz Fanon, James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and Amy Césaire. Their influences can be seen in his ability to interrogate the past while offering urgent questions for the future. James is a graduate of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and currently works in the field of geospatial and environmental science, where his technical expertise complements his enduring passion for land, place, and historical justice. As the 2025 Emancipation lecturer, James returns home to contribute to an ongoing conversation about freedom, identity, and the unfinished work of liberation. His presence is both timely and deeply meaningful as we mark 191 years since the formal abolition of slavery in Anguilla. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. James Malik Fleming.
The rebellious dwell in a parched land, a timeline of resistance during slavery. When I read the topic, I knew immediately I had heard it somewhere, a long time ago. Then after a while, it came back to me. It was something from my days in church. It sounded like something from the Psalms, but where in Psalms? Or was it as one of the many verses I had to memorize as a child for punishment? Because they did it to us children over and under God's word. We had to memorize every verse before we get fixed. Although slavery was abolished over 100 years before I was born, I also thought that asking me to do this small part in this evening's very important program was some grand conspiracy with my children to get me back in church. No. They just wanted me to be ready to stand in with something for my grandson should he not be able to make it to Anguilla. Thank God he's here. The rebellious dwell in a parched land. Wait a minute. Was the psalmist talking about us here in Anguilla, brought here in bondage to suffer on a dry land? Because we were not only rebellious, we are also resilient and resistant. Tonight's lecture, I hope, will dispel some of the myths that have been cultivated in Anguilla by us since the abolition of slavery, such as there was no real slavery in Anguilla because there was no sugar, and that slaves loved their masters, and that the masters so loved their slaves that they bequeathed their land to them. So there was no inhumane treatment. And that love transcended into the master's willingness to bequeath his land. Now, these are all misconceptions, and that we have swallowed willingly here in Anguilla. But the researcher, I hope, will dispel those myths and misconceptions this evening. To have us Anguilla today claim some of the myths as fact is sacrilege and an insult to the memory of our ancestors who suffered the long night of slavery. The lecturer this evening will also dispel what is now legend, that Anguilla slaves were docile and well-behaved. As recent as 1967, we Anguillians were presented to the world as rebels just for standing up for our human rights. You will hear how Anguillians come to own their land. You will hear about this and many more slave accounts. These myths, misconceptions, or just plain lies will be dispelled by the lecturer. James Malik.
How's everybody doing? We all family, so if I mess up, you can't lick me. We all family. And two misconceptions I'd like to clear up. I'm one, thankfully, only half Fleming, so can't hold that against me. And the Honorable Minister, I think the only reason she isn't here is because she's my cousin, and I see they stuck on the Webster last name in there, so that means she got married without my blessing first, so she must be avoiding me. So, Shelly, I love you, but don't worry, I gotta tell her uncle. I gotta tell her. So this is The Rebellious Dwell in a Parched Land by James Fleming. Frederick Douglass said that slavery, regardless of whom is enslaved, is evil in one of its purest forms. That same evil has left a lasting impression on the DNA of the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade. My island, and the island of my ancestors, Anguilla, follow suit, as the majority of the population traces their heritage to slavery. Unfortunately, there persists a set of sentimental myths found both internally and externally that Anguilla was never a slave society, or that Anguilla on the island, or that slavery on the island was easy and barely present. I am here to affirm an alternative set of facts. I'm here to affirm the fact that there is no nice way to own a person. The genesis of these narratives stem from Anguilla's lack of a large-scale sugar plantation, akin to St. Kitts or Jamaica or Haiti, our very unique demographics and population, and spotty historical record-keeping. I'm here to assert that Anguilla's history, landscape, and people are intrinsically linked to slavery. I also attest that slavery was not only present from the genesis of the colony till emancipation, but employed the same brutality and dehumanization tactics as some of the most barbaric slave societies of the New World. This same brutality is the catalyst to a plethora of resistance techniques and schemes utilized by the slaves of Anguilla to ensure their survival, escape, and eventual emancipation. By the end of this presentation, my hope is to have dispelled misconceptions about Anguilla's slave past and give you, the audience, a glimpse into what has led us here today. Thank you. Right. Go to the next slide, guys. Origins of slavery in Anguilla. The best way to understand slave society Anguilla is to first examine its origins. Since the very first European settlement of Anguilla in 1650, there has been a black presence on the island. The first English settlers arrived from St. Kitts, escaping harsh agricultural taxes imposed for the protection from the hostile French, and with them, they brought their slaves. They were soon accompanied by indentured servants from Barbados. The names of these early settlers and a concise consensus has been unfortunately lost to time. However, what we do know is that the first settlement was an unauthorized, exploitive colony that lacked an official commission by England's king. There was no official encouragement for migration like in other colonies, and the early colonials were more akin to squatters than pioneers. By contrast, the settlement of St. Kitts in 1623, Nevis in 1628, Antigua in 1632, and Montserrat in 1633 had all been covered by commissions from either the king or the governor-in-chief, not Anguilla, however. This origin, combined with the island's small size, flatness, and arid, rocky landscape, made it ill-fitted for large-scale agriculture and a true export economy. The inability to contribute to the metropole's greater economy in turn made the settlement a nuisance in the eyes of British colonial higher-ups. The feeling of being unwanted and neglected by England still permeates the Anguilla psyche to this day. A typical example is found in a 1676 report when the deputy British governor of Antigua describes Anguilla as, quote, a barren, rocky island ill-settled by the English and of small consequence. Another report by the governor-in-chief in London said, it were to be wished that Anguilla were as much underwater as above it. Still don't like us. The early settlement was all but completely wiped out in a violent raid from Carib Indians that left several dead or enslaved. And the only witness of the account included a Negro slave as one of the victims. Over time, the island would be ravaged by French and Irish pirates and refugees, who we know settled the eastern part of that island, which I have some heritage there as well, in the late 17th centuries. Over time, what was left of the settlement was populated by debtors, pirates, freedmen, runaway slaves, and poor whites who came to the island because of the allure of unclaimed land. This undesirable class of settler and lack of economic success led to continued abandonment and resentment by our metropole. What came out of this was a disjointed and minuscule plantocracy, growing cotton, ground provision, tobacco, and the likes that lasted until the island's late turn to sugar in the 18th century. Sorry. By 1683, there were at least 100 enslaved Anguillians. However, the increase in sugar production over time led to more and more slaves and a decrease in free persons on the island. Like other slave populations in the New World, Anguilla slaves were primarily brought from West and Central Africa, and there are records of slave ships having visited Anguilla after collecting slaves in the Bight of Biafra, the Kingdom of Bonny, and Senegal. There was also a slave depot in Nevis that was home to many slaves from Senegambia. My next slide here, I've got a graphic. Actually, I don't know how well we can see that, but I've got a graphic from one of the few limited returns we have in Anguilla about slave life, and it shows the origins of slaves in Anguilla. There weren't too many by 1827 that were actually born in Africa. Most at that point had been born in Anguilla, but some had been born in Africa. So really interesting. And I'll provide this to somebody at the end of this so we can all take a look at our leisure. All right. Next slide, please. All right. Slaves in Anguilla were employed in many ways, the majority being subsistence farmers and salt miners in the early days. Later, they turned to sugarcane harvesting. The sugar period was relatively brief in Anguilla, which in turn meant that continued neglect and eventually a downtrodden economy. The economy being the crux of any good colony, Anguilla's poor economic performance left it without any proper forms of government or true effective official judiciary body. This made the period of slavery in this marginal colony virtually lawless. The absence of a true establishment has led several to conclude that with no civic system meant no hardship or reason for strife among the black population. System, therefore, is key to the dubious myth of the better treatment of slaves in Anguilla. In reality, the lack of civic institution and system made the island rife with slave abuse. In 1824, a commission from St. Kitts revealed that Anguillian slaves were not given food or clothing and were sometimes given a couple days out of the week to grow their ground provisions. This was out of the inability of the slave owner to provide any of their slaves because they couldn't provide for their slaves because they couldn't afford it. The slave owner's wealth was insignificant compared to some of the wealthy slave plantations and plantation owners in the region. The only capital many slave owners on the island had were their slaves. If there were judgments against them, they would put themselves in contempt of court by actually sending their slaves out into the woods, because that was all they had. The lack of a system and enduring poverty forces the majority of the inhabitants, especially the enslaved, to steal to make a living. This makes the colony a blemish on the empire. The Governor Matthew of the Leeward Islands laments this fact by stating, "I know not what to do with the inhabitants of Anguilla. They live like so many bandits in open defiance of the laws of God and man. As for being under government, they're out of all notion of that. From time to time, deputy governors from among themselves have been appointed by His Majesty's chief governor of these islands, but they have no authority over them. But what they are able to enforce is with a cudgel." This shared poverty, stemming from an arid land, drought, and famine, is another key myth to the myth of better treatment of slaves in Anguilla. The enduring hardship that becomes synonymous with the island is sometimes painted as a racial unifier. However, the records tell a very different story. It seems that several of the poor slave owners took out their frustrations on the only capital they had. During a reflection on slavery, 5 years after abolition, Lieutenant Governor Colebrook wrote in a letter to the governor of the Leeward Islands that much perhaps may be attributed to the constitutional indolescence of the Creole race, which almost amounts to a malady, where there are no stirring objects of interest or profit to call out their energies. It has moreover been hinted to me that the dark scenes of cruelty and oppression were but too common in Anguilla during the days of slavery. we cannot but suspect that the absence of all restraint affords both opportunity and instances of great tyranny and of practices which would not for a moment be endured under the influence of law and under the pain of punishment for the violation of it. On the next slide, I found something really cool. I'll back to the heart-wrenching stuff in a second, but I did find a list from that 1827 slave return about jobs of the different slaves in Anguilla. Some of the most notable ones that I found on here were cattle keepers, herdsmen. The vast majority were field hands, but cultivators and water drawers. The one that got me was the turkey minders. We had 2 turkey minders in Anguilla. I remember getting into an argument with my grandmother years ago when I was just a little boy that there's no way that there's turkeys in Anguilla. I never saw a turkey. There's fowls in everybody's yard, but I had never seen a turkey. So she was right. She got me. You remember turkeys? That's what it sounds like I'm hearing. Oh, I don't remember. Well, see, there were peacocks when I was a kid by my neighbor, but all right. So, as expressed earlier, much of the brutality, back to the bad stuff, much of the brutality imposed on the slave populace of Anguilla was informally permitted and at times encouraged because of the lack of institution. This is contrary to the popular notion of the absence of a civic institution being somehow a savior. Even with a less stratified slave and slave master wealth disparity compared to the other islands, the racial, socioeconomic, and class dichotomy of owner and chattel was still present. Without slave laws, masters and overseers could punish slaves as they saw fit. As Governor Maxwell put it while lamenting the institutional failure on the island to Lord Bathurst in August of 1823, without laws or civil institutions, there was nothing to, quote, check the lawless disposition of many of them, or to protect the weak and helpless, or to punish the frequent acts of oppression and cruelty practiced on the slave population who were unregistered. Despite some shared hardship, the whites in Anguilla during the colonial era were not colorblind. The discriminatory white supremacist power structure that pervaded most of the world and still does was still at play on the tiny island. And at the heart of that discrimination was anti-black racism. The records show that black culture was, and to a degree still is, criminalized, and punishments are often arbitrary and handed down with extreme prejudice. The black slave was viewed as nothing more than chattel, and having black African heritage automatically placed you lower on the caste system totem pole. The colonial records offer insight into the white colonists' thinking during this time, and I found a couple of interesting examples, at least interesting to me, that kind of shows the insight as to some of the white folks on the island. In 1776, John Alloway and Edward Hughes get into a big argument that escalated after Edward accused John, Mr. Alloway, of having, quote, Negro blood, and he accused his grandmother of being a mulatto in secret. The mere assertion becomes a major sticking point in their feud and is referenced every time they take each other to court, each demanding financial compensation for the insult. That same year, Mary Payne, a planter's wife, is accused of doing a Negro dance in her yard in the night, a charge she has to go to court and clear her name of. In 1758, when the slave Pero is to be hung for insubordination and treason, his owner, Sarah Lake, repulsed by his behavior, but not surprised, relinquished him to the governor and council, as one would release a dog to the pound or a piece of land to a bank. Got some notable instances of brutality in Anguilla. There are many recorded instances of vile and brutal treatment of the enslaved black population on the island. The atrocities range from mutilation, whipping, forced marooning, lynching, banishment, and burning alive. Noted historian and authors of one of my favorite books, The Annals of Anguilla, S.B. Jones highlighted 2 unique examples of arbitrary cruelty from the records that I always stuck with me. A Mr. Fleming of Long Bay severely whipped his young slave boy, leading to his death. At first he was in prison. However, Dr. Hodge secured Fleming's release after he had tested that the boy died of lockjaw. In the second case, the court ordered the right hand of the mulatto girl Sally to be cut off for insolent speech to one of its officers. In a similar case, in 1831, female slave was flogged to death in the valley for not preparing her master, one Mr. Boyle, his coffee before he went fishing. Many Anguillan slaves are also used as pawns in larger feuds between the white planters on the island. The records make several references to Negroes brutally killing one another at the behest of their masters, often while guarding their land and crops. The land and crops that they worked but didn't own. And now today we have young Anguillan men shooting each other. So, cycle continues. We see a glimpse into the brutal slave era during a feud between the limited authority of the island, one Chief Justice Pickwood and Dr. Benjamin Gums Hodge, two recurring characters throughout the records. Pickwood, detested by the nature of the colony, in a letter to William Carty of the grand jury, states, Hodge brings under your consideration condition of the slave population and states, as if it were the only grievance, their inability to recover small debts. Why, let me ask, did he dwell on such a paltry trifle and leave the great and vital question of their food, their raiment, their clothing, and their protection from the oppression of their masters untouched? Is there any provision made in any of these respects to the laws? To a certain extent, and by my agency there is, such barbarous cruelty by flogging in the valley, on the Sabbath day too, as to cause a resident from St. Kitts to burst into tears at the sight, and declare that he had never witnessed or imagined such a case of blood. He urged the ferocious master, whose name is in my possession, that he would not dare to do so in St. Kitts, where a manager had recently been fined and imprisoned for giving 25 lashes without the precautions for which the law decrees. And the reply obtained was, I should like to see anyone interfere with me in doing what I like with my own. Pickwood supposed that such cases were not of rare occurrence, for otherwise this must have excited a big sensation, which it didn't. The assistant judge to the party complained of, upon one occasion, visiting Anguilla, landing at Dog Island, he said he found a very intelligent and superior female slave, the property of Mr. Assistant Justice Hodge, the same Benjamin Hodge in question, banished there by the arbitrary will of her master. At my intercession, and had I not succeeded, was prepared to do so more than intercede, she was allowed to return to her family and friends at Anguilla. It appeared the assistant judge had formerly cohabitated with the woman and had a child by him. This is the story of Charlotte Hodge. She was a very notorious female slave. She was a favorite of one of my biggest influences on this island, Don Mitchell. He always held her up as a source of resistance and rebellion in Anguilla. It was a landmark case of slave abuse on the island at a time when slave masters were very rarely prosecuted. It was part of a larger intercolonial feud, as I alluded to earlier. That's part of the reason it really got pressed. But regardless, Charlotte was a mulatto woman. She was lusted after by every man, white or black, that came into contact with her. They loved her. She was very smart. She knew how to play multiple sides with one another. She was marooned on Dog Island because she had a tryst, with one of her slave owners. And when his wife found out, she cut up her own clothes and set fire to them and accused Charlotte of doing it. So she was banished to Dog Island and then put in a cellar for a long period of time. Charlotte was known for her cunning and her complaining. She really didn't think of herself too much as a slave because she had been given so many privileges by these men in her life because she was this smart and pretty red woman. That's why she's a favorite of Don, probably. A similar case that I'd like to also bring attention to, while not in Anguilla, was in Tortola, another island, sister island, that was, quote, I guess, it's always been described as being beset by lawlessness. It was by one of their colonial officials, Governor Arthur Hodge, sorry. Hodge was indicted for murder back in 1811. He was notoriously cruel to the slaves, and he ended up murdering this one slave, Prosper, because Prosper picked a mango from the ground, which, how dare he, first of all. And when Hodge demanded that he paid 6 shillings for it, Prosper said, no, this is a mango on the ground, I'm not gonna pay for it. He was whipped to death. This became, normally, you would think, well, slaves got whipped to death all the time. But Hodge was a notorious psychopath. And, while he isn't really always called that, he was a mass murderer. He would torture his slaves to death. They said at one point when his wife died, he looked around and was shocked. There were no slaves to bury his wife because he had killed most of them himself. He used to torture the young slaves, many of them his kids, by holding their heads under the water when they disobeyed him. He was just notoriously sadistic. He had whipped several others to death, flogged them to death in front of everybody. I'll read one instance I have in my notes here. Bella, a small mulatto girl of about 8 years of age, who was under his offspring by his slave Peggy, was flogged and beaten to death by Hodge personally. My goodness. Another one, Samson, a boy 10 years of age, was dipped in boiling liquor until all of his skin peeled off. Hodge previously had over 100 healthy slaves on his plantation. And then by the time, like I alluded to, of his wife's funeral, there weren't enough slaves to dig a grave for her. One witness testified that in 3 years, at least 60 Negroes had been buried on Tortola, and only one had died a natural death. It got that bad to the point where they realized they had a mass murderer running a territory that the British themselves had to hang him, of which he protested until the end. He maintained his innocence, that they were his slaves to do what he pleased with. All right. Okay. Next, I'm going to talk about one of my favorites. To escape these brutalities, Anguillan Negroes employed one of the most common forms of resistance among the population. Escape. Throughout the 17th and early 19th centuries, Anguilla saw a considerable number of native slaves escaping to other islands, while also serving as a haven for outsider slaves on the run. In the slave return of 1827, there was only one runaway slave, a male. However, between that year and 1831, a 4-year span, some 83 slaves absconded from their estates, 61 of whom were male and 22 were female. Prior to the 1827 return, there's significant evidence to suggest that Anguillan slave owners were dealing with a very serious runaway problem. As early as the 1750s, we see correspondence between the government officials of the Leeward Islands and the officials of Spanish Puerto Rico to protest the asylum offered by the Spanish authorities to the slave runaways from the British Caribbean, notably Anguilla. The Spanish didn't offer this out of sympathy to slaves, but to simply spite the British. We see earlier, during the abortive attempt of the Anguillan colonization of Crab Island, a lot of Anguillians went to colonize what's now Vieques in Puerto Rico because things were so bad back in Anguilla because of the dry soil, that when the Spanish raided the abortive colony, they ended up selling off a lot of the Negroes they had brought with them. So they didn't do this out of the kindness of their heart, where they were later offer asylum. They did it just to, oppose their colonial rival. The Spanish officials utilized these slaves as a way of destabilizing the presence of England in the Caribbean. When one Gilbert Fleming of Anguilla complained to officials in Puerto Rico about the issue, he was mocked. Don Agustin Perea jeered that the slaves were coming to Puerto Rico in search of Catholicism. The runaway problem persisted towards the last years of slavery in the Anglophone Caribbean. As late as 1822, for example, Governor Maxwell of the Leeward Islands protested to London for the want of a registry in Anguilla, It indicated that the local slave owners had immense practical difficulties in recovering their slaves from neighboring islands who had either absconded or it's either been allowed to work for a little bit for self-hire. This is after the French attack in 1796. And they were hesitant to return once their contracts expired. According to Maxwell, without an office of registry in the colony, Anguillan slave owners felt that their property was presently held by a very slight tenure. The lack of administration was to the detriment of slave owners in this case, as they couldn't keep track of slaves, as it became a frequent issue on the island. Several runaways, in addition to escaping, found other ways of hindering planters on the island amidst their escape. Several maroon themselves and take to the bush, while some take a more, let's call it, unconventional approach. In 1774, a slave named Excelius, belonging to Edward Gomes, was said to have made his elopement for several months, and in that time was accused of burning several pieces of his master's sugarcane, his own personal cane. It was noted that in doing so, he killed and destroyed many stock on the island, in an already struggling colony, which was deemed taboo. So Excelius was banished from Anguilla completely, and I do not find his name in the records at all afterwards. In September of 1756, 2 slaves named Pero and George, Pero you guys heard of earlier, were accused of escaping to St. Martin during wartime between the English and the French, specifically during the 7 Years' War, and assisted a French vessel and privateer in raiding the island. Upon capture, they were both sentenced to death, Pero by hanging and George by burning alive. Now, to read this next piece, I think this is a very personal thing for many people here, especially those with extended family in other parts of the Caribbean. So to do so, I wanted a St. Martiner to do it. So, Mr. Fleming, Mr. Frenchman, this one's on you.
You want to St. Martin? It's called the Runaway Network. And I particularly like this one because Anguillians have always been like their own pirates. My grandmother included. Well, let me just state that she was a smuggler, my grandmother, and spent 6 months in jail for smuggling. And she said it with such pride. Another thing I wanted to say was about St. Kitts and the malice that existed between St. Kitts and Anguilla. People. I had no reason in the world to hate St. Kitts or the people. None. What I had, however, was every time my grandmother mentioned it was a tone of malice. And I picked that up. So that was my reason. So I suppose that was every other Anguillan reason, except maybe the older, intelligent people who knew the real reason. But that was my reason. Okay, I'll do Malik's research here. During the era of slavery, and even after 1834 abolition in Anguilla and the other British colonies, there existed a network of fugitive slaves within the Leeward Islands. There existed various reports and records of fugitive slaves from the nearby French, Swedish, Danish, and Dutch territories. I didn't even know it had Swedish territories in the Caribbean until he pointed it out. St. Bart's was a Swedish territory. And Anguillians were there too. But their record was so bad that the St. Bartholomew's had to get them out. He did the research. I didn't even know. I was in St. Bart's on a day trip because I wanted to see it. I went to a store. I'm a double talker. I went to a store and I saw a shirt I liked. Mona, you were there? And I turned to Mona and I said, I would love to have that shirt, but I don't think I can live in it. The shirt was $780 US. A shirt. You know? So I swore I wouldn't go back, and I didn't. During the early 19th century, in the wake of the Haitian Revolution and the larger revolutionary period of Francophone Caribbean, hundreds of slaves flocked to Anguilla. This increased racial tensions on the island as these newcomers were considered fugitive slaves and foreign Negroes. In February of 1828, Secretary Hutchison received word that nearby nearly 100 slaves from St. Martin and a few from St. Croix, who were chiefly idlers and who cannot subsist by honest means, were endangering the safety of Anguilla. Upon emancipation, however, in 1834, the numbers increased as French, Dutch, and Danish, also Spanish, had not yet been granted their freedom. So you could imagine, when was St. Martin? 1848 or something like that, like 10 years after abolition in Anguilla. So you could imagine them coming over by, as soon as the sun set, they get on a log or whatever, could float and come over. So it was, the French started to complain to the British because they were encouraging their slaves over there from Anguilla. So at one point, Anguilla, before the French abolition, Anguilla had a lot of people from St. Martin. So you can understand why St. Martin and Anguilla are linked today. The commander of French St. Martin wrote to his British colleague on the Dutch side in 1835, remarking that he had noticed a noticeable communication between the blacks of St. Martin and Anguilla. The communication was so frequent that, and so well known that it had drawn the attention of his superior, the governor in Guadeloupe. So the notoriety of Anguilla traveled without telephone to Guadeloupe. These newly freed blacks from the British territories sailed between islands and were causing detrimental effects and having a negative influence on the slaves on the French, Dutch, and Swedish territories. He meant that foreign alien Negroes were inciting the slaves on the French side to flee the 10 miles across the straits to freedom in Anguilla. Swedish St. Bartholomew St. Bart's, only about 23 miles from Anguilla, saw a similar trajectory. Other neighboring Leeward Islands during the time, it was noted that surprisingly, the black populations of the Leeward Islands were observed to understand one another through an English-based Creole, despite being under different European powers and possibly from different African countries. But they still managed to communicate. That's why we could speak in so many different languages with our body, you know. Says something, doesn't it? Says something. And we communicate that way better than any people I've ever met. Anguilla was key to the black St. Martin's vision of freedom. And after 1834, they were eager to join their newly emancipated family just a few miles away. The British at that point employed the fugitive slave law that granted freedom to Negroes who made it to their colonial possessions. Several Anguillians assisted in helping their brethren make it across the channel to the other side, sheltering them. An infamous figure in the St. Martin mythos is the slave woman Bathsheba. I think they have a play about this lady. I haven't seen it yet, but they did a play about her. Bathsheba, who in 1835 escaped to Anguilla with 5 others, including 2 of her children. A street in Amsterdam is named after her, in her honor. In 1843, 5 years before the French emancipation, enslaved people were caught trying to make the journey across the water to Anguilla. One slave, when questioned what was waiting for him in Anguilla, simply replied, "Something good for me." The judge, upon sentencing, took note when referencing Anguilla that on this closed island, we know that relentlessly in the eye of the enslaved shines an inextinguishable light of freedom. News of the July Revolution in France reached St. Martin in 1830. In the wake of the Second French Revolution, black St. Martiners made a daring bid for freedom, took to the streets in Marigot to demand their freedom. That's because of Anguilla. And were massacred in the streets.
He loves the applause, y'all. Gotta wait. He's a dramatist, eh? Just one quick note, Mr. Banks had a great name for that network. He called it the, I trust him. I trust him. I trust him. We're all family here. Ken had a great name for this runaway network. He called it the Saltwater Network. That's a Ken Banks trademark. I thought that was great. I love that name. Real quick on the screen, this becomes a very serious problem. There are Anguillians that are noted in every newspaper I've found, from American newspapers to Dutch to Danish to Swedish and French, having escaped and are just living abroad, or or fugitives coming into Anguilla, and it becomes a very persistent problem. All right, next slide, guys. So, contrary to prior beliefs, there does exist evidence of a planned slave insurrection in Anguilla, and it possibly has a connection to the 1736 Antigua slave conspiracy. The Antigua conspiracy of 1736, or the Prince Claus Rebellion, as it's colloquially known, was a foiled slave plot that, if successful, would have seen the expulsion of the white population from Antigua and the establishment of a black African kingdom in the Caribbean. The plot was to ignite a 10-gallon barrel of gunpowder during a celebration of King George II. The ensuing explosion and noise would serve as a signal to the black populace to attack any white person they saw, and ultimately install Prince Claus as the island's ruler. Prince Claus, whose real name was thought to be Court or Kwaku, was a slave from the Gold Coast captured during the Ashanti-Iguafo Civil War and sold into slavery. During his time in Antigua, he was proclaimed King of the Coromantese. Coromanti or Cormanti was an English word used to refer to Akan slaves from what's now Ghana. Upon discovery of the plot, Prince Claus and his main co-conspirators were tried and executed. Prince Claus and some of the main instigators were executed via torture wheel. Some of those conspirators had ties to the infamous 1733 Akwamu, also from the Gold Coast, St. John slave revolt, as well as an earlier rebellion in St. Croix. During that time span, in the 1730s, there existed this contagion of rebellion in the Eastern Caribbean. And according to correspondence among Governor Matthew of the Leeward Islands and a closed affidavit of one John Hanson, the revolt in Antigua was just the beginning. That the slaves of St. Bart's, St. Martin, and Anguilla had also hatched a plot against their white masters. The affidavit states that the contagion has taken into effect in St. Bartholomew and is discovered in Anguilla and St. Martin, with Hanson relating that on December 15, 1736, while he was on St. Martin, his brother read him a letter from Monsieur Pimon, governor of the French side, which he said the slaves in the island of St. Bartholomew were rose in a rebellion and killed 11 men of the white inhabitants, but that the remainder kept together, being about 30 men, not daring to separate. However, Pimon had more pressing matters to see to, because a plot had also been discovered in his own colony of St. Martin, where 8 slaves awaited execution, and that the whites were kept on high alert. Hanson believed that Pimon tried to get assistance from Martinique to quell the rebellion, which he might have. He also states that the slaves in Anguilla were supposed to join those of St. Martin's the 26th of December, 1736. It's unknown exactly what transpired in Anguilla and what the plan was, if any. Even the details surrounding what happened at St. Bartholomew are not, fully transparent, and the records are pretty scant, because there really has been no exhaustive research done on this topic as of yet. It appears quite a few times in different, realms of academia. I first heard of it reading one of Gerard Horne, an author from America, from one of his books. But what we do know, and what's always been theorized, was that the slaves of St. Bart's, St. Martin's, and Anguilla were in cahoots with one another. They were in some type of collaboration. They had already had evidence of them using each other to escape to different places, and so it was thought that they all had planned this together, and that somehow they could all understand one another despite what, French, Dutch, and English, colonial presence. Recently, and you could thank Mr. Banks for this, for egging me to keep researching this, we found some new insights. For the first time, I've been able to find additional reference to the rebellion outside of just that enclosed affidavit to the governor. I was reading an old colonial newspaper, actually from America, that talks about this rebellion, this time with a slightly different account. One Captain Lee, a completely new character who's not mentioned at all in the first affidavit, says that he saw 10 white people. Originally, also Captain Lee is from Antigua and Anguilla. He's probably was a privateer or a pirate or a smuggler. But he saw 10 white people killed in St. Bart's. So, more research to be done. All right. While enslaved black Anguillians made up the majority of the population for most of the colonial period, there did exist a subclass of blacks on the island. Smaller in numbers, but often better privileged, Anguilla's free people of color, often referred to as colored, free-colored, or mulatto in the records, like their equivalents throughout the New World, represented somewhat of a petite bourgeoisie. These were mixed-race folks with varying degrees of African and European ancestry. Caught in the middle of a black slave and white slave owner dichotomy, many free-colored strive to enjoy the monetary and social class privileges of the latter. Several colored on the island even owned slaves themselves. Mr. Boyle, the gentleman who had beat his slave to death in the valley for not preparing his coffee, he himself was part black. Several colored in the island became notorious. Mr. Boyle especially for mistreatment and cruelty to slaves, to prove that they were of equal footing to the white slavers. This wasn't unique to Anguilla, however, as throughout the West Indies, Latin America, and mainland North America, there exist instances of mulattoes seeing themselves as distinct from their darker and liberty-deprived counterparts. This isn't a blanket condemnation for all mulattoes and free colors in Anguilla, as several went on to use their limited privilege to work for the greater good of Anguillians or found solidarity with the black slaves, or weren't afraid to confront the whites on the island. Some notable examples from the records that I found really entertaining was when in 1776, a free mulatto named Amboy, who I later found out was a Connor, beat and collared a white mariner when he ordered him to perform his duty as a sailor. Not liking his tone, Amboy picked him up and even threatened to kill him by throwing him overboard while they were sailing to Tortola. In 1823, a slave named John, a Negro, aka Jerem, that's what they called him. Even back then, Anguillians were giving each other nicknames with no explanation that made no sense. Jerem led an attack on a white planter named Joseph Horton. Jerem was the property of Mrs. Elizabeth Wells. He got his fellow black brothers, 3 others, Ned, who was the property of one Mrs. Brooks, and John, the property of Miss Catherine Connor, and a man named Mingo, the property of Alexander Brooks. All 4 of the Negroes brutally assaulted Joseph, only to be stopped after interference from an indentured servant named Mr. Tully. After it was determined that he was the ringleader, Jerem was ordered to be jailed and whipped. However, the mulatto sons of his owner, Jeremiah and William Wells, came to his defense. They normally served the warrants in colonial Anguilla during those times, and I infer, and I have a strong suspicion that they were possibly relatives of his, refused to collect him and outright said that they would protect him. It's important to note that lighter or red-skinned didn't automatically denote freedom or always better treatment. There are light-skinned slaves and darker-skinned emancipated Negroes in the records as well. Many mulattoes in Anguilla that were observed at that time had attained their freedom and status because of their relation to wealthier slave owners and planters who would will them their freedom in and will them their manumission in their wills. The free colored of Anguilla often served as colonial militia, planters, and mariners themselves. And there seems to be a noticeable distinction in the records you can see where emancipated, noticeably black people are referred to as free black, while the more, let's call it racially ambiguous, lighter-skinned free mulattoes are called free colors to assert their complexion. All right. The records paint the picture of free-colored and black Anguillians as being caught in class purgatory. They are on average better treated than the typical enslaved Negro and aren't always punished as arbitrarily, with several exerting that privilege over non-emancipated Negroes. However, they don't enjoy the same full rights and privileges of the white European descendants. It doesn't matter how much influence or clout they possess, land they own or money they have, They're still barred from certain jobs and positions and are discriminated against in various fields, and had to sometimes endure violence at the hands of the same white oppressors that several of them sought to emulate. Mulattoes, several with the same last name as their paler cousins and descendants, are often reminded of the slightly darker hue whenever they try to assert their equal status. This becomes a very significant problem, and in the wake of this happening throughout the Caribbean, actually, in 1831, the free blacks and mulattoes of Anguilla, in search of equality to their white counterparts, drafted a petition demanding equal treatment as free citizens. Much to the dismay of the white Anguillians, officials in St. Kitts and even Britain felt that free blacks in the West Indies getting rights may ameliorate racial tensions. However, the whites in Anguilla remained steadfast in their disapproval. They refused to budge from atop their limited pedestal. William Carty of the Anguilla Council had this to say: "On free people of color, I should not place them in a point of feelings with reference to the whites in a worse situation than at present by an exciting jealousy, injurious to the comfort and prosperity of the community, at the same time pointing out the evident policy of attaching this class of persons to the whites. From time immemorial, the free people of color have precluded from filling any public situation, nor do I think it likely that much harmony would exist with a line of distinction withdrawn and a perfect leveling system to ensure what would happen, which once begun would eventually happen. Witness Santo Domingo," he's referring to Haiti actually at this time, "between whom an everlasting grade of distinction has existed and will exist so long as time endures." William Carty went on to say that if free blacks got the same rights as whites in Anguilla, what would eventually happen was all the white people would move to America, and Anguilla would be left as just a black island, and it would go to the dogs. One of the most notorious cases, and one of my favorite cases, and just nuggets I found digging through old records, didn't actually occur in Anguilla, but it is about Anguillians. A pair of free-colored brothers, Samuel and Joseph Richardson, originally from Anguilla, changed the course of history on the island of St. Bart's because of a major incident that occurred in the 1800s. This incident centers the murder of Joseph during a riot in 1821. Joseph was a part of the colonial militia, and during a liquor-induced riot between the colored militia and the militia band, Corporal Joseph Richardson was killed by a sharp object. After the murder, there was an attempted cover-up by the governor, one Governor Nordling of St. Bart's. This is during the Swedish period, as well as a seemingly willful delay in justice being brought to the murderer. The reaction to this murder, as well as the historical context, adds several layers of notoriety to this case. This all occurred during the time of tension between free blacks, mulattoes, and the white establishment in St. Barthélemy, with several using this incident and lackadaisical approach of convicting the murderer, who was believed to be a white man, as a rallying cry for equality. In retaliation, Sam Richardson sent a letter to the King of Sweden outlining the injustice that befell his brother and in protest of the authorities' unjust handling of the situation. Samuel was bold in calling out the racism he feels is influencing the ordeal, as well as the racism of the governor. Samuel and other black mulatto folk on the island believed that there was no desires for the authorities to find and convict the culprit because he was white and Joseph wasn't. Some cool tidbits from the letter. Quoting Sam Richardson, "On the 4th of July, 1821, at the celebrations of the Prince Royal's birthday, the 2nd Company of the town's militia, after being dismissed, I believe under the influence of liquor, given by the governor, got into a quarrel with the band, in consequence of which a fight was started by some white people in the most violent manner towards the others, and in the consequence of which Joseph Richardson, my unfortunate brother, was killed, and 4 or 5 other colored people wounded. All fair-minded people had reason to hope, once this unfortunate incident became known to the governor, that an autopsy would be quickly ordered on the body of Joseph. But to the surprise and great astonishment of this island, this was not done until the following day at 4 o'clock, when the body was already putrefying." The letter continues, mentioning that several people of color had sent a petition to the governor earlier, reminding him that an autopsy should be performed before the body was buried to ascertain what kind of instrument or weapon caused the fatal accident. The petition changed nothing. On the contrary, it treated me and the other signers as rebels and conspirators, and the governor did nothing until at last the case was heard in a court of justice. And one of my favorite quotes that Sam says, Sam is a very racially conscious mulatto black man from Anguilla. St. Bart's has always had a much higher white population relative to Anguilla, and many of the blacks in St. Bart's were actually foreigners from Anguilla and St. Martin. So Sam had this to say: although separated from our dear and beloved sovereign by the vast ocean, we are nevertheless convinced in our hearts not only of his great gentleness and fatherly goodness, but also of his impartial justice to all his subjects in general, whether rich or poor or of different color, knowing well that all of us, white men or black, are the creation of the same God. Okay. Another petition for equality and free colored people took place in neighboring St. Bart's after this whole incident. St. Bart's was basically just whiter, Frencher Anguilla at this point, because it was also home to a lot of pirates and smugglers. We see the mulatto class frequently at odds with the government and the Swedish crown. The petition was spurred by a series of incidents and mistreatments of the free colored class at the hands of the white establishment. Petitions of this nature were becoming more and more commonplace, and historical records showed that these kinds of petitions happened in the Danish West Indies, St. Martin, and even Louisiana. They were part of a larger political movement in the Caribbean and the New World, where free people of color sought improved legal, economic, and political rights. In several of these territories, the freed class were growing larger and larger and occupying new roles in society. In St. Bart's, a rebellion of the colonial militia even took place during the Swedish era, with several of the insurgents being malcontent mulattoes. Interestingly, several of the mulattoes and black folk, as well as foreign slaves, were originally born in Anguilla or St. Martin. The corrupt colonial governor hated all black people on the island, and he was very dismissive of the petition and outlined his hatred of the mulattoes. The Swedish crown felt that the mulattoes needed to be placated, fearing another situation like Haiti. In a way, they would be correct. In the 1820s, a plot was hatched called the Dukendrav-Holstein Expedition. And the plot of this expedition was to create a mostly colorblind, free-colored republic based in Puerto Rico. This was in the backdrop of all the rising free-colored classes in the New World, as well as all the political revolutions in Latin America and the Caribbean. The expedition was led by Henri Olstein, a Prussian-born ex-French soldier serving under Simón Bolívar from Gran Colombia. Two of the main conspirators were the Bigard brothers, mainly Philippe, aka Titus Bigard, mulattoes originally from Guadeloupe, but based in St. Bart's. The role in the plot was to revolt against the whites in Guadeloupe. Then, capitalizing on colored discontent, utilize people from the neighboring French, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, and English and Spanish islands and install a new government in Puerto Rico. The plot was to utilize pirates and a bunch of other South American revolutionaries. The new nation would be called República de Boricua, a reference to the original Taino inhabitants of the island. The proposed name change was most likely inspired by the recent change of Saint-Domingue to Haiti, the island's Taino name. The plot was also supposed to get assistance from Haiti, as they were assisting with the rise in the New World republics in South America. In Puerto Rico, it was discovered that Pedro Dubois, a mulatto working with Holstein, had inspired many blacks in his neighborhood to revolt. The slave owners discovered this, and he was tortured into giving information on the plan. And the role of the mulattoes in the Black Islands and the Leewards was, discovered and stopped because of two brothers from St. Martin. So, your people messing up again. One, Abraham Balborda. To be fair, their father was from Statia, so we can give Statia some guff for this too. Gave testimony to the governor of St. Bart's on his own brother, Samuel, who was also signed the petition from earlier, that he had been recruited to take part in the expedition to be launched in Puerto Rico. Samuel was jailed, and the plot was eventually stopped. And when the governor told the Spanish about the plot, the expedition was forced to sail to Curaçao, where their vessels were captured. Interestingly, the insurgents didn't plan to fully abolish slavery, as they felt it would collapse the sugar economy of Puerto Rico, again showing the feeling of being different as free-colored and not regular Negroes. All right. Misadventures abroad. Several black Anguillians were noticeably troublesome during the colonial period, especially in other people's islands. Several Anguillians, both black and mulatto, slave and freedmen, constantly found themselves in foreign courts. Anguilla has frequently been a land of remittance and emigration, as several often leave Anguilla temporarily to find work or a better life in a neighboring island. While a theme throughout Anguilla's history, the trend is most noticeable during the apprenticeship period after slavery, where many Anguillians were eager to earn and their masters were eager to get some return on the investment. And even predating apprenticeship, I also came across several accounts of runaways absconding to sister islands and trying to live actually in secrecy and masquerade as free. Several of these stories are contentious because, to the dismay of many black Anguillians, there were a lot more white people in other folks' islands. And that noticeable difference in demographics led several, especially the free mulatto Anguillians, to get their, what I like to call, Negro wake-up call. So one of the most noticeable stories that Mr. Fleming had referred to, in St. Bart's again, several Anguillian women were noted to be the most fierce people on the planet. They were not well liked. I know I'm seeing out in the crowd several Gwalias here today. So you have, the reputation has always been a part of your culture. You all are known for beating people up. It's not good. They weren't happy. These were Anguillians getting deported. This is pre-Trump, and they're getting deported. So this isn't, in 1835, a free black Anguillian woman named Pia was accused of publicly assaulting another woman, older, much older than her, named Prudence. She was, as the court claimed, one of many slaves of English subjects in Anguilla staying here, who through the slave emancipation of 34, been freed from bondage under the condition of serving as an apprentice for some years. Pia was given jail time and eventually banished back to Anguilla. One of the colonial officials referred to her as, quote, very rude and impertinent, using the gaudiest and most obscene expressions without consideration for whom she spoke to, and was additionally noisy and rowdy in the streets, for which the renewed call was made for her banishment from the island. Another Anguillian, one Betty Lake, so we know she's a lake. So I see some lake women here today. So I'll leave you with that. Received similar treatment for fighting another woman, as well as attacking a man with a knife and biting him in the middle of the street. Jeez, I'm Brett. Her deportation was delayed because she recently had twins and was still breastfeeding, which did not stop her from attacking the gentleman and biting him in the street. Not to be outdone by their women, also in Gustavia and St. Bart's, one Henry Marchant, a supposedly free black man, got into a fight with a local merchant. Upon hearing this, Benjamin Gums of Anguilla heard his name and claimed that Henry was his runaway slave and was quite positively him, just disguising himself as free. Another slave was a free-colored named Adam. I think Adam was a Richardson. So if you're a Richardson, this is also on you. After they threatened to take his ships away, Adam was a pirate from Anguilla that was doing very well for himself. Took part in one of the most noticeable battles of pirates and the Swedish crown in Anguilla. And he masqueraded as a free man, and he went and took part in what was called the Jupiter Expedition, and battled a ton of the colonial governments in the Caribbean as a pirate. I don't know if he got banished or not, but he was another problem in the island. A sadder one now, unfortunately. One May evening in 1838, this time in the Danish West Indies, Christian said, in St. Croix to be exact, at around 11 p.m., a free Negro named William Gums was observed by 2 police officers who asked him who he was, after which he proceeded to run away. The officers caught up with him and asked why he ran. William, very slick, excused himself by saying he thought they were trying to rob him. They did not like this. During further questioning, it was emerged that he was a fisherman, but his clothes were so simple that he was taken for a slave, and the police officers thought that they were least justified in questioning who he was. Gums was not from the Danish West Indies, but was from Anguilla, where he attained his freedom in 1828. The officers found that William Gums did not have a residence permit, however, and he was sentenced by the Governor General to 25 lashes and was warned that he would be deported if a further offense took place. By the way, something I failed to mention, Joseph Richardson, his family was compensated in Anguilla after he was murdered. I believe his widow got, I think it was 2 goats and a little piece of land. So that back then, even now, not bad. As displayed in some of the earlier incidents, many black and colored Anguillians, domestic or abroad, frequently are burdened with providing proof of their freedom. Anguillians often need an official document of manumission detailing their freedom, especially when traveling, because a black person couldn't provide this during that time. They would often be treated as a slave and possibly sold back into slavery. Foreign courts are rife with claims of freedom by black Anguillians. One of the most notable cases occurred again in St. Bart's. We're going back. You guys couldn't help yourself from going there. When John Gums is arrested for not having his freedom papers. John Gums eventually had to have testimony on his behalf, stating that he was known that his mother, brother, and himself were free Negroes. He was given the opportunity to present documents attesting to his manumission by Benjamin Gums. All right. Another one of the most common forms of day-to-day resistance in Anguilla during the era of slavery was theft and smuggling. As my grandfather pointed out, our family is full of smugglers. On both my sides of my family, they are full of smugglers. My mother was a Lake and a Rogers. Everybody smuggled. She does not pretend to be, oblivious to it. They were all smugglers. Her great-grandfather, Bunka Lake, was a smuggler. Everybody was a smuggler. Her mom, her grandmother, everybody stole. Look, come on now. It's who we are as a people. We're all family. We know. When they ask you, when you come into customs, anything new, anything to declare, I know, I'm seeing some of you, okay? Any gifts? And come on now. The practice is, of course, still a part of Anguilla's cultural psyche and mythos to this day. However, many don't know its origins. This illicit practices often coincides with Anguilla's association with pirates and privateers during the golden age of piracy, but mainly it was the key survival technique employed by the majority of the populace to endure this hellish ordeal. Anguilla's colonial records are full of examples of the black population resorting to theft or piracy and smuggling as a means of survival and procuring sustenance. I picked apart some of the records because there's a plethora of records. John Hughes's slave, a Negro girl named Suki, was brought before the council on 1758 on charges of stealing goats and fowls and other small stock to the value of 50 pounds currency. A Negro man named Mushel, belonging to Joseph Lake, was found guilty that same year because he was stealing sugar out of the house of another man, his neighbor, Richard Rogers. He was sentenced to 39 lashes. While in June of 1759, another William Gums was brought charges against an unnamed slave belonging to George Madonna for breaking into his store and stealing his goods. 7 years earlier, Anthony, a Negro belonging to Thomas Flanders, and his friend Jeffrey, a Negro belonging to Peter Harrigan, were jointly charged with breaking into a store owned by Nicholas Dunbar. And taking out of the store, quote, several barrels of flowers, which were his goods. The various famines and droughts and the French attacks that besieged Anguilla would often lead to an increase in theft and smuggling for periods of a time. The more devastation in the territory made the lowest of the caste resort to straight criminality. Colonial officials even started to take note. During especially tumultuous time periods and depending on the manner of theft, harsher punishments were often doled out. Certain crimes of this nature from the enslaved populace were often met with harsh castigation in the form of flogging, hanging, or banishment. One of the most notable cases, and this story was actually told to me first personally by Colville Petty. Once he figured out who I was happy to tell me this. In 1820, 6 slaves were accused of breaking into the home of Elizabeth McDonough, a white woman, beating her with a stick, robbing her, taking every bit of food and whatever valuable they could out of the house, all while being stark naked because clothes were very hard to come by during those time periods. The slaves, Jacob Brooks, Scipio Brooks, London Brooks, there's a lot of Brooks apparent in these records. Miranda Brooks, again, Bacchus Derrick and Scipio Bryan were hung between 10 a.m. to noon at Crocus Bay on September 25, 1820. Another notable case was in 1831 when 3 Negro slaves, all runaways, broke into the house of Maria Gums, a white woman, and stole mackerel, flour, and tobacco. One of the slaves, Sam, in a bid for his own freedom, became a witness to the Crown and gave evidence to help convict his 2 fellow black cohorts, Frazier and Rochester. His accomplices were sentenced to death. A common theme in many of the records of internal theft by slaves or emancipated blacks are them typically being caught stealing food and occasionally rum, which is also a need. That's also a need. This indicates that many are doing this out of a need for survival. The islanders are becoming bandits by necessity. Cycle black Anguillians have always been doomed to repeat. The theft increases during instances of drought or natural disaster, and Anguillians are forced to live like robbers as a consequence of the poverty and neglect of the island, a theme that comes to define Anguilla to this day. Don't worry, guys, we're almost done. Okay, this was kind of the rough stuff. It's a bit mean, but this is just our history. Violence and the lawless period. So in reviewing Anguilla's history, right, it's always noted that Anguilla is lawless. Starting at 1650 and going all the way up until the mid-19th century, you can call this the lawless period. The island and its inhabitants have just always been synonymous with delinquency and a complete defiance of the law. However, there is a noticeable split in the era, and there's a watershed moment in 1796 during the French Revolutionary War, when Anguilla was raided by the French, and Anguilla was essentially burnt to the ground. Several homes, plots of land, and businesses ceased to exist completely. Men, women, and children were murdered, assaulted, and taken from the island. This left Anguilla in a complete state of desolation. Anguilla received no remuneration from England, unlike Dominica and St. Vincent, because remember, we were the lawless black island. We weren't worthy of reparations for what we endured. This halted what little progress Anguilla had made as a fledgling colony and depleted the few gains of many of the inhabitants. This was followed by a series of hapless events of misfortune in the form of drought and hurricanes. While Anguilla frequently lacked true administration and have been noted to always been pirates and home to people of ill repute, these newer factors debuting during this time started to kind of tweak the makeup of Anguilla and delve the island further into the doldrums of near anarchy, akin to the early settlement days. Theft and piracy from the enslaved occurs throughout the time from the very beginning. However, in the mid-19th century, well, not really mid, I should say like 1820s, 1830s, you start to see a rise in these events. You start to see more and more slaves start to steal. You start to see them not just quietly taking a bag of flour from master's, pantry or something. It's noted that they start to do it with, quote, force and arms. They're taking it, and they're taking it violently. And if you try to stop them, they'll do something to you. So you better get out of their way. Faced with the failure of the salt crop in the 1820s until 1832, as well as a dying sugar industry constantly beset by drought, many Anguillians, white and black, remained in a state of pauperdom. A severe famine had reared its ugly head on the island that saw several starve to death. The island was also battered by a hurricane during this time, so it just became hell on earth. Securing provision was also complicated by the unsuitable import situation that developed. The failure of what little subsistence agriculture Anguilla could produce led to a reliance on import of American goods. Trade from nearby islands like St. Bart's and St. Martin was hindered because they had to sail further to St. Kitts to clear the goods, right, before going to Anguilla. So this made the prices in Anguilla higher for local Anguillians. And they responded by increasing the rate of piracy. They just smuggled more. They just stole more. That was the only way they could survive, right? And this affinity for smuggling completely deprived Anguilla then of free port status by the British, because they're like, we're not going to make you guys a free port. You keep robbing everybody. So Anguillians were caught in this colonial catch-22. Things aren't made easier because you guys are bandits, but you have to become bandits to live. So sometimes, out of pity, Anguillians would be given free port status for 6 months out of that time. But this was so inconsistent, combined with the poor correspondence that was complicated by St. Kitts, Anguillians were often left in limbos. And while the dead bodies were piling up and funerals were becoming such a common theme, and at one point, one of the customs officers noted that there were 12 in one day at the hands of starvation. Smuggling problem had become so bad during this lawless period that the stipendiary magistrate of the Leeward Islands complained that more than half of the provision on Anguilla was smuggled. It wasn't produced in Anguilla. Many Anguillian colonists at this time went to St. Bart's for reprieve, as they were a Swedish free port. And a lot of times then later they'd be joined by escaping slaves and free colored. This meant that what little money was actually generated was being spent in a foreign country, which led to a complete collapse in domestic industry, right? The revolutionary period in Europe and the Caribbean up until Anguilla's gaining emancipation saw an increase then in the fugitive slave population coming to Anguilla, like we alluded to earlier. But this caused a host of other problems because they said that those fugitive slaves were just mixing in with Anguilla slaves and nobody was respecting the law, right? Then you start to see an increase of violence of, slave on the slave master. One of the most notable incidents that I read occurred in May 17th, 1833, when 4 black men caused a riot by viciously assaulting a planter, slave owner, named Samuel Hancock Gums. The attackers were William Derrick, the slave of Benjamin Derrick, Joseph Harrigan, a free black man, William Harrigan, another free black man, and another free black man named Nelson Gums, right? Surprisingly, none of the attackers were hung. All the men received a month's jail time, or at least the free men received a month's jail time. William Derrick, however, was supposed to be given 20 days in jail, along with 25 lashes going into the jail and 25 lashes coming out, right? William Derrick tried to escape prison, and he failed. After that, I think they hung him because I do not see William Derrick after the records after that. So, didn't go too well for him, right? Around this time, too, you start to see a noticeable pattern of black Anguillians turning on each other, right? You start to see, stories of, starving, absconded slaves being violent to other slaves. And then there's even more tension complicated by the changing racial situation, because then you have the free coloreds who kind of think of themselves as better. One of the interesting stories about the free colored versus the enslaved population occurred when Thomas Richardson, free colored, killed Joseph Fleming, a slave, after Fleming, quote, grossly abused his wife, right? And injuring his stock. Fleming's wife testified on the 1831 trial that Fleming owned a sword and said that he hoped to cool some of these mulatto fellows as I have at Nevis. I found the record of him actually doing that at Nevis. He somehow got away because he did it to a free colored in Nevis, which they didn't really care that he was colored. It was just another case of black people killing black people. So he eventually got to come back to Anguilla, where he did what he did and eventually passed. As tension built, Justice Pickwood wrote Maxwell on 1831 and said that a band of fugitive slaves from Anguilla's plantations had gone beyond petty theft to organize a, quote, system of plunder, and no effort had been made to stop them. He said that the deplorable distress which pervades every class of the community, leaving those who have been accustomed to the comforts and superfluities of life without the means of providing our daily bread. The devastation, accompanied by increased incidents of theft and white flight to surrounding islands, caused the many plantocracy's influence to wane and whatever authority they had to subside, as it exhausted Anguilla's pitiful justice system and made a mockery of what little administration existed on the island. It is noted, however, that the want of management did subside as white planters left more and more. All right? So, this is when Anguilla, almost wind it down, this is when Anguilla firmly becomes the black sheep. We were never liked before, but now, with all the incidents of theft, now with the white folk leaving, it becomes completely unbearable, right? Tiny, poor, black, and lawless. The feelings were not spared, right, when it came to referencing Anguilla. Some of my favorite quotes, I'll just read a few, in the interest of time. I cannot but think that undue importance is attached to this settlement of Anguilla, where at the very most there are 1,500 people living in a state little above that of barbarism, without one element of a future wealth among them, or any reasonable prospect of becoming useful to this country, in reference to England. And so we may go on until the whole apparatus of government is established at this place, where there is scarcely anybody to govern. Another one said, Anguilla has been the opprobrium of our West Indies colonies for the last century. So we were the worst of the worst, right? And I want to take this time to just quickly say that it's no secret for those not in denial, right, that our little colony, since its inception, has just been completely ignored and been the subject of, oftentimes, unfortunately, gross neglect at the hands of Britain. The relationship for the majority of our history is at best apathetic and at worst willfully negligent. This spiteful inattention could be attributed to many factors such as our informal origins, our size, our inability to generate a profit, our piracy, whatever. But chief among these reasons is our race, right? Anguilla, for the majority of its existence upon a European discovery, has been a majority black island. That majority are the descendants of slaves, the bottom of the bottom on the race and class totem pole, right? And this was outright said when Leeward Governor Smith proposed a small $20,000 loan for Anguilla, to be shared, by the way, for Anguilla, Barbuda, and British Virgin Islands, the last remaining of the Leewards, right? The proposal was scoffed at and met with sarcasm from British Crown officials. One official remarked that he agreed with the governor as to the similarity of the islands, but then added that on the point of similarity, they were all poor, right? He said they're all united by poverty. They're incapable of making progress. But he kept going, and he said that, why are they fit for a loan? Not a single white man lives in any of them, right? Noted author and psychiatrist and one of my personal influences, Frantz Fanon, describes the colonial-colonized relationship as a denial of recognition, right? And we see that at play in Anguilla. To Britain, as a black island, we weren't worthy of recognition. And to them, the plight of black islanders was seen as immaterial. Racism depersonalizes, and it robs us of being recognized as equals. and our struggles, both current and old, remain unseen. I've got more quotes about Anguilla as a failed colony, but I think you guys get the gist. All right. So, one of my favorite cases in Anguilla involving black Anguillians occurs after one of many shipwrecks in Anguilla in 1833. We were all eventually acquitted, so we somehow got away with this. Hundreds of pages of depositions after a French brig from Guadeloupe called the Central American wrecked off Anguilla, and it was eventually plundered, allegedly plundered by the Anguillians. The incident in question caused a mini diplomatic incident and was no doubt spurred by the ongoing famine, as well as prevailing anti-French sentiment on the island, right? The chaos unfolded after the initial wreck when an Anguillian's custom officer, one John B.B. Morris, had become inebriated and struck a French soldier. This came after he tried to extort the Frenchman for food and liquor from the wreckage, right? He threatened the French crew with violence from the starving black population. He was quoted as saying, if he and his friends weren't satisfied with the champagne, he would let his bulldogs go. He demanded first 2 cases of champagne, then he wasn't satisfied and asked for 4 more. That's when the commotion started. Amidst the commotion, around 400 Negroes were said to have come to the wreckage, armed with sticks, poignards, knives, and grong apples, rocks, right? Ready to loot and steal whatever they could. The black population were witnessed throwing cargo overboard and swimming it ashore to bring back to the bush and to their huts. When chastised by the French for their piratic behavior, black Anguillians notably responded with, "The white people stole so much, we never had a chance." Now, the white Anguillians tried very hard to cover this up, be like, hey, this was just a misunderstanding, John was a little drunk, things got out of hand, let's be friends. The black Anguillians, this was celebrated, they were very happy with the haul, and the French were angry. This made one of the French newspapers the front page, so you guys were doing a good job, we got to the front page in France. La Courrier Française, the captain of the ship gave testimony, and this was a traumatic experience for him. The crew escaped with their lives, but they were severely mistreated by the inhabitants of the island, who he said only live by piracy, and they are marauders. It was necessarily, this is him describing his incident, he said it was necessarily to forcefully surrender everything to them, right? We were at first very happy to have our lives saved, but a last effort by the ship's lieutenant almost cost him dearly. He returned to the vessel to try to make them release their hold. These madmen, more than 20 in number, immediately attacked him, daggers in hand. Seeing the impossibility of fighting against such an unequal force and his certain loss by remaining on board, this brave man threw himself into the sea and swam to safety. He must have swam back to St. Martin, right? So we in Anguilla, we're used to dealing with invasions. So it didn't start in 1967. So these guys were making everybody proud. An excerpt from the letter of protest that I translated that was issued by the governor of Guadeloupe to Governor McGregor of the Leeward Islands. He said that from a population so eager for plunder and threatened in their very existence by your bands of Negroes armed with sticks composing the crowd, eager to separate by all means the wreckage of the shipwreck to make it their prey. Not only was no help or no assistance offered to my people, but the theft and disorder encouraged by the inaction of the civil authorities took place with the consent and excitement of the collector of the island's customs, Mr. Morris, the crown officer, designated as the sole salaried authority in the country. Of 400 Negroes who took advantage of this opportunity to begin plundering again. This is not the first time, Mr. Governor General, that such misdeeds had been committed in the same place, and undoubtedly through the lack of the same authority. Public knowledge indicates the inadequacy or the absolute lack of any repression in this area of government. This is a watershed moment in Anguilla's history. It perfectly encapsulates the arduous 19th century and the lengths that many Anguillians had to go to for survival, right? As referenced by the press and the captain and the governor of Guadeloupe, this was not the first time an incident like this occurred in Anguilla. And Anguillians had developed this reputation of, at one point, if your shipwreck's here, you better pray. In 1831, the same John Morris himself endured a similar ordeal after a ship was seized from St. Bart's for not declaring its cargo. Upon hearing the news, he was assailed by a mob of 200 people and threatened with personal violence. It appeared that the cargo belonged to them, they thought, everyone securing their own share and taking it away from him. That same year, this is a little darker, the American schooner, the Caroline, was lost in Anguilla, with all of the crew perishing. This led to a very bad diplomatic incident because the Americans accused the Anguillians of killing the crew. But the Anguillians asserted, no, we didn't kill the crew. Nobody killed the crew. There was an inquiry from St. Kitts. They came, they cleared Anguillians of any wrongdoing. Notably, the goods of the ship were saved. Flour and fish, two of our favorite things. So I'll let you guys draw your own conclusions. We were cleared of any wrongdoing, but just saying, the crew doesn't survive, but the flour and the fish make it. I'm like, okay. All right. Decades later, in the 1860s, my grandfather's time, there was another shipwreck on the island. This time, a Spanish brig laden with 2,000 pounds of flour. The Anguillians offered to help the shipwrecked crew. However, things turned ugly when, after helping salvage the wreck, the Anguillians didn't want to accept the money, but wanted to be paid in the flour the ship was carrying. The government response was to appeal to St. Kitts, who responded by sending armed policemen and soldiers, as they were eager to do. Britain even asked for assistance from neighboring St. Martin. John Morris appears throughout the colonial records. He's a recurring character. In his most notable appearances, he's often drunk, completely intoxicated, and in one of his drunken escapades, he played the unofficial role of emancipator. According to an account by Arthur Lloyd, Mr. Morris, on his arrival from St. Kitts, met a man by the name of Guy, belonging to the Mount Pleasant estate, and taking him by the hand said to him, "You're all free." There was a great many slaves in hearing of Mr. Morris who must have heard what he said to Guy. Since Mr. Morris's arrival, several slaves have completely absconded from their plantations. Mr. Morris was in a state of intoxication at the time. Morris claims his innocence and chalks it up to one big misunderstanding. He is fined for this incident. I believe that Morris did this on purpose. I think this was completely calculated. I think he wanted the blacks on his side to help rob ships. That has always been my conclusion. All right, so now I want to welcome a very special guest. Okay, we can talk about that at a later time. I had a whole thing for Ken to talk about the church and emancipation, but I'll just finish up my last two slides and let you guys get back to your nights. Some say the end of slavery came in 1834. However, this isn't entirely true. The Emancipation Act decreed that older slaves were to be apprenticed for several years. The apprenticeship was often just slavery under a different name, with the newly free Negroes often doing the same work they did while enslaved for a token, paltry slum. In some islands like Antigua or even Bermuda, certain slave owners found it was actually cheaper to pay the former slaves a meager wage rather than feeding and clothing them, so they accepted the Emancipation Act. In other islands, the news of a conditional freedom did not sit well with people. In St. Kitts, a full rebellion took place by the black population who had no desire to keep working in the same plantations they were supposedly free from. Violent riots took place and several escaped to the woods. Anguilla apprentices mainly worked in the neighboring islands, and they saw this as a chance to emigrate, even if only temporary. Domestic industry was dying in Anguilla, and as the conditions previously described were unbearable. In the Danish West Indies, a similar practice was adopted in the wake of a contentious abolition that was hastened by a slave revolt. However, the new system was just as predatory. as slavery. The Labor Act, as they called it, gave the now free Negroes a fixed, measly salary and made them contracted laborers and indebted to the same plantation they toiled as slaves. This made labor conditions even worse, and when Black Virgin Islanders tried to emigrate as Anguillian apprentices did, the Danish government in response charged for passports and demanded medical certificates for travel. This awful treatment led to the infamous fire-burn labor riots. Right? A common theme tied to the myth of easy slavery in Anguilla has been the high number of Black landowners in the island compared to others. Black Anguillan land ownership came primarily from two sources. The first was willing of land and freedom to the mixed-race mulatto children of planters who didn't want to see their children poor, destitute, or whipped. And the second was several of those debtors going to other islands and using the money they earned to buy small pieces of their master's lands that they rented, right? British slaves were officially free and emancipated in 1834, and noted historian and politician Eric Williams argued that the British Empire's commitment to slavery declined as the profits of slavery decreased, and the economies of the Anglophone Caribbean dwindled. Right? He believed the rise of industrial capitalism and wage labor made it more economically advantageous to eliminate the competition of slave labor. Right? Anguillan slaves were said to have been at work until the last days before the Emancipation Decree came down. And in anticipation, the limited authority on the island actually requested the Catition militia to be stationed in Anguilla because there was a, quote, spirit of insubordination among the Black slaves. Right? With several of these that went on later to work in apprenticeship and several forms of informal slavery well into the late 19th century. Eager to recoup their losses, several slave owners took their slaves in Anguilla to be sold to other islands for profit. Several went to Puerto Rico, where slavery was still legal, right? And illicitly traded their slaves. Slave owners were also compensated for their loss in wages. It was estimated that there was around 20 million in terms of compensation, which is around 16.5 billion when adjusted for inflation today, and 400,000 awarded cases for slave owners in the Caribbean, Mauritius, and the Cape of Good Hope. And Anguillan slave owners got the same rate as St. Kitts slave owners during that time. All right, last slide, guys. Anguilla's lack of an overarching establishment during the period of slavery has unfortunately afforded many, including sub-Anguillians, the opportunity to downplay our ancestors' struggle and battles. Outsiders often trivialize our struggle and accept no culpability in issues that exist to this day because of slavery, a common tactic used in dealing with the Black diaspora. I've found for Anguillians, this is often out of shame and a notorious reputation for inverting and redefining hardship to avoid humiliation. We have this phrase that my mom used to always like to say, I ain't worse than nobody. For example, we've redefined our nomad status and our frequent exoduses from the island as a hardworking spirit to hide the fact that we've been a remittance economy for centuries. Even our boat races that we love so much were birthed out of seasonal migrations off the island. We have a bravado about smuggling to hide the grim necessities of dealing with drought and starvation. Anguillan women are touted for being frugal and resilient to endure and hide the stigma of dealing with outside children and broken homes, and the necessity of single mothers to contrive and save. I would encourage all Anguillians not to rush to escapism when confronting these issues and historical truths, as it is disrespectful to our ancestors. As evidenced, our forefathers went through hell and didn't take it lying down, and we're the byproducts of that hardship. The same spirit of defiance and perseverance was present in '67 during the Revolution, and it's our duty to correct these narratives and remain vigilant and knowledgeable about our history, including the trials and tribulations, so that no one can invalidate what we've been through. Special thanks to Don Mitchell, Carlisle Rogers, Tim Hodge, Colville Petty, David Carty, and Ken Banks. Thank you, guys.
Long night, We came and we got our bellies full, right? So despite the length, it was good. A great history lesson. So we learned a lot. Raise your hands if you've learned something new tonight. So thank you, Mr. Fleming, for taking us for that in-depth. It's clear that Malik Fleming has done a lot of research into Anguilla's history and the timeline of resistance during slavery in Anguilla, and we can all appreciate him debunking the myths, and that although we might not have had the slave rebellions like Jamaica and Barbados and the other islands, that slavery was also barbaric here, and that the enslaved persons in Anguilla were treated harshly, despite what we've been told. So that's why it's important for us to know our history and for us to do the research and tell our stories. Because when we hear it from somebody else, then it is not the right picture. The right picture is not painted, and the truth isn't told. So I will now open the floor for any burning, because it's been a long night, any burning one or two, any burning questions, one or two persons, before we close out the program. There's a microphone there, so if you have no burning questions, nothing that you'd like to ask Mr. Fleming, that's fine. Going once, going twice. Okay, so there was an online question. Could you just share it, please, quickly? Anybody else? While we search for the online question? Somebody? Thanks, you're pointing at somebody? Oh.
Good evening again, everybody. There were a series of comments, so we couldn't find the exact question. But Malik, I think the gist of it was the depth of your research and where did you do it and how long it took you to get this much information.
As evidenced by the fact that we're all still here, it took a long time. I did do a lot of research. I perused all of the limited colonial records I could find. A lot of our records have been either destroyed or lost to time, and they're pretty scant. But I perused all of those, looked through old colonial newspapers, books, literature, court and colonial records of other neighboring islands. It took a lot. And there's still more to be done.
All right, so now I'll call on Mr. Sanford Richardson, who is the congregational steward here at Ebenezer, to bring us expressions of thanks.
If I was smart, I will do like our dear Mr. Smith and just say, thank you. And everybody would understand. As we've come to the end of another evening in commemoration of Emancipation, the 195th anniversary of this Ebenezer Chapel, the Malliouhana Poetry Emancipation Lecture Organizing Committee, persons like Evan Carty, Annika Hughes, Carla Harris, my dear friend Janzi Webster, and Renee Henry, and Dr. Phyllis Fleming Banks and the Ebenezer congregation, we'd like to express our thanks to our presenter. Mr. James Malik Fleming, for a dynamic, very informative, packed and thought-provoking, at some points deeply emotional presentation. It's obvious that you spent much time doing this, doing your research, and it paid off because despite its length, you still had us spellbound. It's kind of strange that we enjoyed so much bad news, you know. But it's not that we were enjoying it, it's just that the reality was that this, I want to say that that was us, but very often as you spoke, you almost like you were in the present for certain things that you were saying. We are still very rebellious. We are still trying to survive. And I was You want to say something? You want to wait till I'm doing? Okay, good. Yes, so I'm saying there's a lot for us to reflect on tonight and moving forward. That we have come out of a horrid past and a curse that we need to put behind us as a people. So when we heard emancipate ourselves, that's what we mean. We need to emancipate ourselves. And then as you spoke, my mind went to a calypso by King Shortshot entitled The Fire Coming After. You all may want to note it and listen to it, because in it he makes a very compelling argument. We say stealing is stealing, and killing is killing. But in that song he says there's a difference between a man who steals because he's in a position to do it, and a man who steals in order to survive. That was part of what I was hearing in your presentation. So we thank you very much again for it, and your grandfather, Mr. Felix Fleming, for your input and your introductory prologue to the presentation. We were blessed to have our Reverend Candice Niles invoking God's presence with us with the invocation, and we were ably chaired by another dear friend of mine, Mrs. Rosanna Brown, who chaired the proceedings very admirably. Rosanna. We recognize the input of the Ebenezer family for continuing to support this annual lecture series, and also the input of Mr. Lennox Vanderpool, Roots Bingi, the Ebenezer Men's Fellowship, Mr. Elliot Gums, for sharing the music tonight. Media, including Radio Anguilla, Class FM, Cool FM, Upbeat Radio, the Anguillan newspaper, Lloyd's Live, and KCN Television. We thank you for ensuring that those who could not be here were able to follow the lecture. We recognize the input of the Ebenezer technical team as well. Thank you very much for assisting in this. Our colleagues at the Anguilla Library Service, the Department of Youth and Culture, and the Department of Education, these are people who are behind the scenes. We thank you for your input in this year's lecture. Right? Yeah. And most importantly, we especially thank you, the audience, those of you who are still here, very much alert for this historic Ebenezer lecture presentation, and those who joined us online for sharing in this experience. Thank you very much. Now I want to invite Chairperson of the Malliouhana Committee, Dr. Phyllis Fleming Banks to present tokens to the presenters.
And good evening, everyone, and we are delighted that you're still here because the journey and the conversation continues. And I know I told Malik, James Malik, that this is the first part one for this conversation. And even I know that the persons who are here will continue to share with you after we have formally closed this evening. The conversation will continue online because, as Lloyd pointed out, there are quite a number of persons who are interacting and querying, and we are so happy to have this. And we want to welcome you back again as well, and we want to continue the conversation. It does not have to be in this forum, but we do have community engagements as well, and whenever you can find that possible, we want to continue the dialogue. We want to present this token of our appreciation to you this evening on behalf of Ebenezer and the Malliouhana Poetry. It's one of the books born in slavery by the Methodist minister as well. So we want to say thank you very much. And to the senior Mr. Fleming, as much as you made those thoughts against Fleming, we know where you got that wicked sense of humor from. We want to say very happy, how delighted we are to have you here. You know we love you. Thank you. And for our chairperson this evening, the lady, we want to thank her so much for joining us and for sharing with us. Rosanna, we are happy to have you with us. And
Thank you for having me.
Good evening and thank you.
And I just want to say, now we understand where our love affair with flour comes from. So I just want to say thank you as well for being here, and your presence means that the story, our emancipation story, continues. Have a good night. Oh, we have a closing song. My apologies. The Benediction. The right hand of God.
receive the benediction. Go in peace, go in freedom, live in peace, live as free people, even as Christ has made you free. Now may the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit rest and abide upon you this night and even forevermore. Amen. Night, everyone.